Welcome back to Have the Oyster, where today we'll be baking focaccia bread. We'll be using yeast, salt, water, olive oil, and what's really important here is using strong white bread flour. The flour we're using today is by Wildfarmed. They specialise in regenerative farming methods. You might have recently seen them feature on Jeremy Clarkson's most recent Clarkson's Farm series. To start, you want to add your yeast to your room temperature water, mix it in so it dissolves, and then leave it for around 5 minutes. This will allow the yeast to get really activated, which will really help as you start to develop the gluten in the bread. I'm using instant yeast here, but you can also use fresh yeast. I'll put all the measurements and full recipe in the description at the bottom. Then you're going to want to take the bread flour, around 500 grams, and then mix that with your salt. When adding the salt, just make sure you stir it through the flour to ensure that there's an even distribution. Then add all of the wet ingredients to the dry, now that the yeast is fully activated, and start to get your hands dirty. Mix it all together. You're going to want it to be a kind of rough, scraggy mass of dough in the middle of the bowl, making sure that you've picked up all of the excess flour from the edge of the bowl. Focaccia is a particularly wet dough, which is quite hard to handle, so when it comes to kneading, the best technique to use is a slap and fold. So what you see I'm doing here is I'm picking up very lightly, rotating as I slap the dough onto the table, and then flick the top over. This will then develop more gluten, get more into the dough, and make it a lot easier to handle than traditional kneading. As you can see, the dough tends to get a little bit messy at this point, so make sure you're scraping it all back onto the bench and bring it back to where you started. But yes, just keep persevering and eventually the dough will start to tighten up and bring it together. This will normally take around 8 to 10 minutes. After 10 minutes or so, you'll notice that the dough is a lot more pillowy, and that's a good sign that there's a lot more gluten developed and air in the dough. So then you're going to want to put that into a bowl filled with olive oil at the bottom, around 40 grams, and then the painful process of tying up all the mess you've made. Now we're going to do the first of what's called a stretch and fold, where you start to develop the gluten more, whilst the dough starts to prune over time. So you'll see here we're stretching the dough out, pulling it back over itself. This also allows the oil to continue to incorporate through the dough. You're going to want to do one of these every half an hour or so for the first 2 hours of proving. After that first half hour, you'll start to see that the dough gets a lot more elasticated as the gluten continues to develop. It means you can stretch it higher and further, allowing that extra strength and gluten to build up within the dough. This will give you much more of a rise on the final bake. what I'm trying to do here is build up lots of elasticity within the dough. You'll see it sort of finishes as a tight ball. This will keep the air in and allow that air to continue to develop throughout the proving process. Towards the end of those 2 hours, you're going to want to be a lot more careful with the dough. You don't want to lose any of that air that's built up because you want that to stay within the dough and keep it light and fluffy at the bake. So you'll see now, rather than stretch and folding it, I'm putting my hands underneath the dough and almost coiling on top of each other just to give it a little bit more stretch, but without losing that puffy pillowiness of the dough. You'll now see at the end of this process the dough has lots of air bubbles on the surface. It's pulling away from the side of the bowl, which shows that the gluten has developed and the dough has developed a lot. And now it's time to pour it out onto a baking tray and start to stretch it out. This is where focaccia gets its traditional look from. As you pour it out onto the baking sheet, you want to cover it in olive oil, which then makes it a lot easier to manage the dough and start to work it without it getting stuck to you. And then what you want to do here is start to slowly stretch the dough out to the corners of your baking sheet. Use your fingers, you can get underneath the dough and stretch it along. It will start to resist as it tightens up. If that happens and it's not reaching the corners of the baking sheet, what you want to do is leave it for a couple of minutes, let it calm down and rest again, and then get back to stretching and pushing out to the sides. You'll see all that air still trapped within the dough and it turns into small bubbles on the surface, which look amazing and taste amazing once baked. And now for the toppings. So I typically would put rosemary on top. I think it's the traditional way of doing it, but you can really put anything you like at this point, any kind of veg that you've got in that's left over or in the cupboard. I've used potatoes, red onions, olives, all sorts of things here. They all come out tasting amazing. Once that rosemary's all been scattered over the dough, I then tend to give it a light pressing again just while the dough's relaxed, and then it starts to incorporate the rosemary a little bit more into the dough. So once it bakes, it doesn't just sit on the top, it's sort of embedded within the dough as well. Finally, I'll sprinkle some sea salt over the dough. Between the rosemary and the salt going on, I tend to leave the dough for 30 minutes or so just to give it an extra rise, and then bake in the oven around 220 for 15 minutes, then give it a turn round and then continue to bake until it gets golden brown. When it's warm out of the oven, it's a great time just to drizzle a little bit extra olive oil on. That sort of slowly seeps into the dough, gives it an extra lovely enriched flavour. And then finally, we'll scatter a little bit of fresh sea salt over the top to give it a bit of extra crunch. And there you have it. There's your focaccia dough. Please like and subscribe for more videos.